Watershed Agricultural Council. Thank you, Commissioner, and thank you, Gail, for being here this morning. As you mentioned, Commissioner, we have an economic viability program under the Watershed Agricultural Council is really working on events like this, but throughout the region to not only are we protecting New York City's water supply and our farmers, but really market their products, and how do we continue to bolster that in this environment and work with the city to do so. So I'm very honored to be here today to be moderating this first panel. I think I'd like all of our panelists to introduce themselves before we really get into the questions, just so you understand the wealth of knowledge that is sitting up here today that has really formed a great collaboration to keep the watershed what it is and continue to move it forward. We have farmers, we have policy, and we have a great history with NRDC. So if you wouldn't mind starting, Eric.
Hi, I'm Eric Goldstein. I'm the New York City Environment Director at the Natural Resources Defense Council, which most of you know is a national nonprofit environmental law firm and scientific organization. I've concentrated on New York issues, including drinking water protection for more than 30 years.
Hi, my name is Eleanor Blakesley. I own and operate Berry Brook Farm in Hamden, New York, where we grow certified organic vegetables. We're right on the West Branch of Delaware in the Watershed.
I'm Craig Cash, I'm the Executive Director of the Watershed Ag Council. We have an office in Walton, in Delhi, and in Westchester County.
Hi, I'm Ken Jaffe. I am not Patrick Ryder, who was scheduled to be here. And I own and operate Slope Farms, which is a grass-fed beef operation in Meredith, which is in Delaware County. And I work with CADE, which is the Center for Agricultural Development and Entrepreneurship, and do a lot of work now with Cornell, having to do with antibiotics in livestock and trying to use procurement to limit their use.
Thank you, and we will have time at the end for questions, so we'll hold off on that till the end. But I first wanted to start this panel, as you're aware, it's your watershed is your food shed. And so, you know, we've talked a lot this morning about the history and how this all is has come about and the hours spent, but I would like Eric to speak this morning about the history of the New York City watershed that might not have been mentioned, and just really the uniqueness of this internationally.
Thank you. As the Commissioner said, New York City's water supply is really perhaps downstate New York's most valuable capital asset. It hasn't always been that way, and just a very, very quick history of 250 years and maybe 200 seconds. New York City, when New York City was just lower Manhattan, Dutch and English colonists and Native Americans got their drinking water from three main sources. Wells, there were about 250 public wells in the 1700s and early 1800s around lower Manhattan. Cisterns, which collected rainwater, and fresh ponds and springs. This was, for many people, the main source of water. There was one of the most significant ponds was one called the Collect, 48 acres right near where Foley Square is now. All of these sources proved inadequate and were polluted for various reasons and in various ways, so that by the early 1800s, New York City was already starved for water. There were cholera and other disease outbreaks. There was the Great Fire of 1835, which destroyed 400 buildings in lower Manhattan. There was insufficient water even for firefighting. And so this led city officials, acting as they often do only when there's a crisis, to look upstate for further water supplies. The Croton River, 40 miles north of the city, was dammed in Westchester County. This is the Croton watershed, is this little green area here. A 40-mile aqueduct brought water to New York City in 1842 when Croton water arrived. For the first time, New York City had an adequate supply of clean, fresh water. There were parades, marching bands, and all other kinds of things. Unfortunately, then New Yorkers started wasting water. And so, beginning in the 1850s with the installation of indoor showers and toilets, many New Yorkers kept their taps running, the population was growing, so over the second half of the 1800s, New York built a dozen other small reservoirs That completed the Brooklyn system, which is this system in Westchester and Putnam County, and things, at least in the 1800s, were okay. 1898 was when New York City consolidated, and parts of Brooklyn, the Bronx, all got together with Manhattan. One major reason that Brooklyn, which was an independent city itself, joined was because they wanted to get their straws into Manhattan's, New York City's water supply. By the early 1900s, again, we were searching for water. City officials were looking upstate to the Adirondacks, even to Canada, thinking about schemes and dreams, but ultimately decided on the Catskills. And so from 1907 to 1917, the city constructed the first of these Catskill reservoirs, the Ashokan and the Schoharie, the Catskill system, plus this amazing aqueduct that brought water from the Catskills all the way down to New York City, went 1,000 feet under the Hudson River to bring fresh water to New York City. Even that was not enough as the city continued to grow and be a center of power and influence. And so beginning in the middle of the 1900s after the Depression, the city once again looked up to the Catskills, built these 4 giant reservoirs west of the Hudson River, the Delaware system. The last one, the Cannonsville, completed in the 1960s. And so these 19 reservoirs now supply over 1 billion gallons, as the commissioner said, of drinking water every day. An engineering marvel and a system that people around the world come to look at and visit, and that most New Yorkers take for granted. Okay, why are we here today? Farmers and environmentalists haven't always gotten together. And in fact, farms, as most of you know, are a major source of pollution, particularly when you're thinking about the large factory farms in the Midwest. Even the farms in the Catskills presented a pollution problem. These are much smaller farms, mostly dairy farms. This problem was most acute in the Cannonsville watershed, which is the one furthest west, because actually the Cannonsville, that was farms. So when the city built that reservoir, it flooded and took by eminent domain farms that were there. And so in that watershed, even in the 1990s, maybe 20% of the watershed was dairy farms. And as a result of this, there was pollution, manure, nitrogen, phosphorus. And so the Cannonsville had historically, since its beginnings in the 1960s through the 1990s, been the most polluted of the city's reservoirs, with pea soup-like slime covering it, eutrophication most of the time. And for that reason, the city would often take that reservoir offline. In other words, we wouldn't be drawing down water from that reservoir when it faced pollution problems. In 1986, the federal government passed the Safe Drinking Water Act that said all surface water supplies in the nation need to be filtered. Filtration is a good thing. If you're drinking water from the Mississippi River, you'd want to have that filtered. But for New York, many in the environmental community and the city DEP felt that we could protect the high-quality waters in the Catskill and Delaware systems without filtration, avoid the expense, and as many of you know, pollution prevention is always better than trying to clean up pollution at the end of the line. So, in 1990, the city released some draft regulations that would implement a tight watershed control program. It was a very tight program, and it instigated a huge amount of political opposition throughout the watershed, including from the farmers. One of the provisions of that proposed rule said that there could be no farming within 500 feet of a watercourse. But if you look at the Catskills, if you're excluding all of 500 feet within watercourses, you're basically saying you can't do any farming here. So the farmers joined with a lot of other upstate watershed officials and were protesting. We were at a loggerheads. Al Appleton was the New York City DEP commissioner at the time, and in the early 1990s he said, let's see if we can find a better way. Working with the state ag department, working with soil, water, and conservation folks, and working with farmers from the upstate community, the idea came up of, let's see if we can work together in a voluntary program. And so what was designed, which you'll hear much more about from Craig in a moment, is this concept of whole farm planning, where voluntary steps would be taken to move the manure piles from right next to the streams, or to prevent the calves from walking through the streams, or to put up sensible buffers of, rather than having crops or grazing right next to the streams. In 1993, the Watershed Agricultural Council, which was a locally driven, voluntary organization, got together, and you'll hear the success story more from Craig. I must say the environmental community was very skeptical of this voluntary concept at the beginning, and we were wrong, and now we recognize that the farmers and the environmentalists can be friends, and we have a joint interest in keeping local farms and their production, and in keeping our water safe, and both can be done, and you all are gonna help us figure out how we take the next big steps today. Thanks for your attention.
Thanks, Eric. And leading into that, Craig, please touch base a little bit on how our organization is both economic viability and water quality driven.
I wasn't going to do this, but since Eric said he was wrong. I invited.
You don't have to reinforce it.
I invited Eric to our 20-year anniversary, and he read an article that he was quoted in, I think, the New York Times, that this would not work. So Eric, at that 20-year anniversary, read the article and then said, "I was wrong." And this is the second time I've heard him say this. But you know, but he was sort of right too, because think about the balance you have to look at from not only the economics of trying to run a farm and also protecting water quality. It doesn't seem to work if you're totally an environmentalist versus thinking just about agriculture. You have to really work at that balance. In 1993, when we were created, I got to tell you, it was created out of fear, because people in those upstate communities thought that their working landscape, their farms, their businesses would be out of business. And so when they came together and there was that synergy of looking at ways to function together, that was really the benefit. And the benefit was that it was voluntary. I think that's a real important piece. You know, we always want to legislate where we want to control outcomes. And it was voluntary, so farmers could voluntarily participate. It was also funded. The projects that we put on the ground for environmental reasons were funded by ratepayers from the city. So that kept the land clean, the runoff into the reservoirs. And it was locally controlled. So I know for some who might not understand this, knowing that you have control locally, that is incredibly, incredibly important. But our mission really is about balance. It really is. It's to promote the economic viability of agriculture and forestry and the protection of water quality. But those two values seem at odds with each other. So for the last 26 years, and if you look in, I brought some actually I need to, but our annual report for 25 years shows the history of the watershed in relationship to the Watershed Agricultural Council. It's very important for us, and you've seen the Pure Catskill Guide and the like, it's very important for us to continue to make sure that that balance exists. Now, if you think about when I said fear, farmers were afraid of their livelihood. They were afraid of their livelihood, so they came together and they began looking at ways to make sure that this could happen. And when you see 93% participation in farms, that tells you that everybody was on board. And I think one of the things that I think we should all be proud of, if you look over at that map which says conservation footprint, you look at the colors there, those are all conservation and economic viability projects in the watershed. That's after 25 years. So when you think about how to balance that, it really is public-private partnerships. It really is. And for the last 25 years, the amount of funds, the amount of energy and participation has been incredible. But one of the things that you can look at that map and you can say, is this one of the cleanest environments just about anywhere in the United States? And the answer is yes. The amount of projects that we put on the ground. So the correlation with that, when we say we are your food shed, we are your watershed, is just that. I mean, think about all the land that's been protected, and I do have to give credit to the city. The city, they purchase land, but then they lease it back to farmers. We do also conservation easements. But I think that's so important, the amount of land that's been protected for agriculture, clean land. I mean, the water commutes every day back and forth, or back, that doesn't go forth, it goes back and forth. And at the same time, we have an opportunity to look at where agriculture could be doing the same type of thing, because we have that protected land, and we have an environment that's pristine. So I'll end for now, but I do want you to take a look at the Pure Castor Guide if you're ever interested in buying products. And this is the marketing message for today. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Craig. I think you've heard a lot of the history, and I want to take this opportunity on where are we going for the future of the Watershed and the Foodshed. And we have two farmers on the panel who are the future and who have helped grow our programs tremendously at the Watershed. And I would like to give them an opportunity to speak about what they're doing. And so Eleanor, as somebody who I've kind of come up with in all of this, talk a little bit about your farm, being a young farmer, any challenges, opportunities, struggles, and explain your newly purchased opportunity. So.
Hi.
You can hold the mic.
Yeah, you can hold the mic.
With my husband, we farm in Hamden. Like I said, we grow certified organic vegetables. I started a small farm on my own in 2012. Met my husband. We started farming together. Found our first location in 2014. And then we were there for a couple of years. This past March, we finally found our forever farm, luckily just 2 miles down the road, but it's a gorgeous, phenomenal property that we were very thrilled and lucky to purchase. And part of what, just to bring this all full circle to see how it really impacts farmers on the ground in the Watershed, a huge part of why we were able to purchase this farm was that it had an agricultural easement on it already. So that brought the purchase price down to something that we could afford. And it was also sort of a fairy tale for the whole neighborhood, like our whole town. This was a farm that had been in production by one family for over 100 years, and nobody wanted to see it not be in production anymore. So we're thrilled that we have the opportunity to keep this farm going, and it's, like I said, just a beautiful property. So we're really excited about that. And then also, we grow now in our new place about 20 acres of vegetables eventually. We have a 3-year transition to build up to that. We do primarily farmers markets, and then also we participate in the 607 CSA. You have a little card in your grab bag with that information. And then we do a bit of wholesale, mostly upstate, in fits and starts to the city for various challenges that we're all here to solve. So in terms of what the New York City market means for us, we see it as a place where we can take our business to the next level. The 607 has grown every year, and that is one of our markets that is, it just seems like the demand we can always do more and more and more. So in terms of the New York City market, that's sort of how we see that. And then I just want to put a little plug in for, we're all used to the status quo of agriculture, and climate change is going to completely disrupt that, and it already has. We're used to buying food from places that will soon have, and already are starting to have, crazy water scarcity or huge weather events. So we need to build our own regional resilience to meet this demand. So, many of you here are already buying locally, and what better farmers to buy locally from than the ones that are also protecting the water.
Thank you. Next, we were going to have Patrick, as Ken mentioned, but We filled it in with just as equal of somebody great that can speak about the changing dynamic of farming in the Catskills and what that means for beef operations. And I will let you take that on. Thanks, Ken.
All right, so Patrick, both his folks ended up in the hospital this weekend, so he couldn't be here. But I'm going to talk about Patrick and say good things about him, which he wouldn't say if he were here. So Patrick, he is my neighbor, and we've worked together a fair amount in the beef world, so I've been on his farm a lot. He raises grass-fed beef as I do, but he also raises a whole bunch of other things. He's a species, he's a livestock guy, so he's raising pork and lamb and goat and chickens, and I think that's it.
Which you're going to have for lunch.
So, he's an interesting guy. He grew up in the Northeast. He's got an engineering degree from MIT. He went to Mexico and lived there for a long time. And then he came back to Meredith, which is our town, and he brought his wife, who was from Mexico City. And so Patrick, and also a group of very skilled workers from Mexico who are working his farm. So he's bilingual in English and Spanish, but he's also, his wife is a chef, so they have a restaurant in Meredith. So he's bilingual in farmer and chef, which is unusual, but represents what a lot of the farmers who are in the Catskills, that skill that they have. And so Patrick works with a lot of kind of higher end buyers, including David Boulay. He works he's in the Watershed, and he is involved with 3 programs through WAC, which are designed to protect the environment and help farmers. So he has basically WAC will come in and invest a bunch of money in your farm if you do stuff that will protect the water. So, in the winter, if you're feeding 200 head of cattle, as he is, there's a lot of manure produced in usually kind of a small area. So they came in and they built this very lovely feeding area, which controls the manure, limits its runoff, so it's not running down the hill towards the Delaware River, which then ultimately goes into the Cannonsville Reservoir, which ultimately comes to you guys. So he has that. He also leases land, so the Watershed, WAC is doing some really good stuff around purchasing grazing land, which formerly they would purchase it and they would just let it go, and it would just sit there and eventually after 40 years turn to scrub or some sort of crappy forest. Now they are allowing it to be leased by farmers. So Patrick has a nice chunk of land which he's doing rotational grazing on, and it's an important part of his farm. They put in a watering system, maybe even fencing. I'm not quite sure about that, but it probably doubled his farming acreage, having access to that very reasonably priced leased land. And he's also has been involved in the farm to market program, which Kristen manages, helping find buyers down mostly in New York City for Catskill farmers. But in some ways, as important as Patrick is, he sort of represents like the best of what's going on in the Catskills, but he also represents the limitations, because his business is based on making that person-to-person connection between himself and the ultimate buyer, and figuring out ways of schlepping his product from 3 or 4 hours from his farm down to New York City. And probably most farmers in the Catskills and beyond don't have that skill set. They don't have that bilingual farmer chef skill. And they are very good at producing something, but they don't really have any way of finding the market. Going to New York City would be as kind of strange as going to Tokyo for a lot of those folks, even though they're very smart people. They just are not familiar. So I think going forward, there's been discussion about city purchasing. What's needed is larger scale purchasing so that there's methods of aggregating high-quality product, coming down to larger buyers. You alluded to some of that with the 607 CSA, which Tiana runs, and would prefer to be farming, but she's doing an aggregation business, which in my view is actually more important than her farm, because she's helping all these other farms. And she's found a scale of purchasing that allows her to then aggregate from a bunch of other producers. So that's really what we need to take the next step, because a lot of those farms that Craig mentioned that were environmentally saved are actually out of business now, because they were dairy farms, and the kind of upland, hilly dairy farms are not thriving. Most of them are gone. But that land is still there. It is still accessible. So to really get people on there producing products that are high quality from a culinary point of view, high quality from an environmental point of view, we need a system of aggregation. We need the pull coming in. We need larger buyers. We need people like Tiana recognizing how important that is, that you do that to aggregate and get the product down to larger buyers like New York City or the Centers for the Aging or larger commercial buyers. All right, thanks.
Thank you, Ken. So at this point,